The obstacle is the way, Roy, you know?
That's right. Okay, everybody, this is Project Herpetoculture Podcast, episode 33. We have an amazing guest today that I'm really excited to introduce, one we've been anticipating for quite a while now. But before that, just going to go through our standard housekeeping. First of all, I'm Roy Arthur Blodgett, your host, joined as always by the dashing Philip Leitz. Look at that. And yeah, I want to give a quick shout out to Dylan and the Animals at Home Network for hosting us. Dylan is the GOAT.
Go, Dylan.
Unison that time, finally. And I also want to, give a shout out to Charlie, who edits our audio. He's a champ, and he really he makes it work for us. So I really appreciate that. And also give a shout out to our generous sponsors. So there's the little magic sponsor plug. And yeah, with all of that out of the way, I'm very happy to introduce our guest today, which is Dr. Zach Loughman. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here. I love this podcast. It's my favorite. So there you go.
And as we said before, that truly means the world to hear that from you. And yeah, we want to get right into it. So sure. You and I are, a little bit acquainted. We've had some good back and forth, but for those who aren't, aware with of your backstory, I'm curious if you could share a little bit how you started out in herpetoculture, and then kind of segue from there into where you fit currently into herpetoculture.
Sure. So I'm that weird person that knew exactly what they wanted to do when they were 3. I had the dinosaur phase we always talk about, that's so infamous. But I wanted to be a paleontologist like immediately. I remember I would get, this is kind of like, it's a little Dahmer-esque, but I would get chicken bones and bury them in my yard and try to forget where they were, and then excavate to try to find them. Like, that's how I went about this. I didn't necessarily need the dinosaur itself, but it was the process of discovery and finding them. And and I knew in the end, it's a chicken, it's not a dinosaur. Now, fast forward to 2023, and that I had an 80s childhood. So could ancestors were dinosaurs, so it wasn't that far off. But anyway, I got around 3rd grade, I started to get a little bit bored with the fact that the dinosaurs were dead, and I was always interested in reptiles. So I ended up getting my first herp. Was given to me by my grandfather. He drove a lot, and this is back in the days where you found a reptile, you brought it home, you threw it in a tank. So he found a box turtle on a road in Ohio, and quite literally put it in the trunk of his car, drove straight to me, knew that I liked that kind of thing. And that was my first herp. And I had that box turtle for a couple years, and then ultimately did what I tell people not to do today, which is released it. So I'm probably responsible for the Ohio genes making it across the Ohio River into West Virginia. But anyway, we won't talk about that.
Heard it here first.
And so after that, my next herp were green anoles. I got those in 4th grade. In 5th grade, I got bullfrog tadpoles. So it was kind of like your standard thing. But when I would get the animals, it was one thing to have the animals, and I loved having the animals. But the other thing that I did is just would voraciously consume as much information about them as possible. I went into the family business. Both of my parents were teachers, so I had access to like the high school biology department, the high school library, the public library. My mom was an English teacher, so one thing I could get whenever I asked for it were books. And I loved reading about the life history, the natural history of the animal. And then when I had it in human care, I wanted to replicate the conditions to see what I read about. Like, that's what it was all about for me when I was 10. So, and I kind of kept that vibe going. I kind of seriously got into herpetoculture when I was in high school. It would have been my junior year. I got the worst pet lizard ever, green iguana. And I actually had quite a few of them. The first couple were just these like satanic, voracious monsters. They were males. when the testosterone hit, they would like literally chase my family. Like everything was wrong with that situation. But I realized like early on, well, not early on, after about the third green iguana, like this is not working. We need to learn a little bit more. And then I kind of really dug in on husbandry as much as I was digging in on the natural history. And that's when I kind of consider my real kind of vibe into herpetoculture. And I did that through high school and through college. I was fortunate enough to go to West Liberty, where I teach, and my advisor, Bob Gordon, who I am forever grateful to. He was a snake guy. He's probably the reason why I do snakes more than anything. And we had a zoology lab, and he basically said, fill it. Like, you put the animals in there, and you got to take care of them, but you have a space to put them in. So with that, I basically squamates were my vibe. So I would do colubrids, I had boa constrictors, carpet pythons, I remember those. Really got into monitor lizards. I had ornates, which were kind of great. Ornate Niles, Varanus ornatus, I think is what it is now. And worked with them a lot. They came in, they were of course imports in the late 90s, and I worked with them and got them to the point where they didn't want to hurt people and were actually quite tractable. And I just like, I loved that whole process. And then I loved reading about the things. And then I knew I was going to go into, at that time, herpetology. Was hell bent on that happening. So I left West Liberty, went to get my master's degree, ultimately ended up in this place called Marshall. And when I was at Marshall, I did a hard 90, and I actually kind of left herpetoculture then because I was doing field work and was becoming a, field biologist basically. And when you do field biology, you're away from home. And I felt horrible having these animals. So I transitioned. It's very similar to what you did, Roy, because I've heard your story as well. So kind of went out, figured out how to be a scientist. Always had a snake or two. I had a Florida king snake and a corn snake that I got in 1999. The Florida king is actually still with us today. It's here at the school. So I always had something in the background. And then while in grad school, that's when I found the crayfish, and that's a whole other conversation, but was doing crayfish biology, was messing around with herpetology, almost like a side interest. And then we got this infamous zoo science major in 2016. And we hired a guy. He was supposed to be in charge of zoo sci, but they went and offered him the director gig at our local zoo, the partner zoo. And so he bounced to that. And then I was told, you're in charge of zoo sci. And so I said, okay, well, the only thing I know are reptiles and amphibians. So if you put me in charge of this, I have a tendency to jump off a cliff and figure out how to land as I'm falling. That's my career in a nutshell. That's the way I like to do things. And so I said, I'm going to fill this building with reptiles and amphibians, and you're just going to have to be okay with it if I'm in charge of zoo sci. And they, I don't know, infamously, I guess is the proper phrase for this, said okay. And within a week, I bought a water monitor for the school. I got the false water cobras. I bought olive pythons. Like, I just bought the stuff that I wanted when I was 20, to be brutally honest. And I knew that I had the space and the resources to take care of these things the proper way, and that I could teach people about it. So that was in 2016. And I was a full-time crayfish biologist at that point in time. There aren't many of us. There's like 10 in the country. Yeah. And I was at a point in my career where I was kind of like inheriting the kingdom, if you know what I'm saying. And then this other career path that I didn't know I was going to be handed on a silver platter was given to me. And literally it was like my 20-year-old self's dream job. Like I still don't understand how this happened. And so I decided at that point, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. And so I jumped in and just started consuming every single bit of herpetoculture information I could. And it's led me to where I am today in 2023. And since then, we've bred a lot of things here. We've raised a lot of things here. We've kind of identified some issues in herpetoculture. And now I have graduate students who can tackle those issues with a scientific point of view, which is kind of cool. Because we take all the subjectivity out of it. It's just objective. And so that's kind of my really long-winded answer as to how I ended up where I'm at right now.
Okay.
So there you go.
That's a phenomenal response. I mean, there's quite a few things I'm curious to unpack a little bit more. But I hesitate to get right in on this because I know there's more things that we want to ask, but you said that there were problems in herpetoculture that you identified. I mean, Roy, do you think there's any reason not to just ask what are those problems? I want to know. I want to know what you think.
Mean, Dr. Loughman just said that he likes to jump off the cliff and figure out how to land.
All right, let's do that.
Falling, so I think we should just go for it.
Let's do that. I'm just going to turn on lights real quick. I'm not going anywhere. Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. Go for it.
So after this whirlwind, and then keep in mind, this is the Zach Loughman perspective. I'm not saying this is the right perspective or the wrong perspective. It's my perspective. And since it's mine and I am me, I can own it. So what's really interesting about my position in herpetoculture is that I am seeing this from I literally can wear 4 hats at once. And a lot of people can't do that. Obviously I'm in academia, so my job is to be a scientist. So I can view herpetoculture through the lens of a scientist. Okay. The field of study that I went into with my career is conservation biology, and zoology. So from the conservation biology perspective, that's the perspective of state and federal biologists. So we have all these regulations that are coming down at the state level right now that obviously are impinging the private side of herpetoculture.
Yeah.
And I see those from the conservationists' perspective, and I'm able to look at that also through the lens of a scientist. And it leads me to a place where I understand where they're coming from, but then I'm a private keeper. So then I see literally the flip side of that at the exact same time, where, I don't want you to tell me what I can and cannot do, but then I understand that, like, what a tegu does to an ecosystem. And you can't deny that, like, whether you want to or not, we can't deny that. So I see those two perspectives. So that's the scientist, academic, obviously the private keeper. And then the other side that I see things from is from the zoo world, like the professional. I am a herpetoculturalist that gets a paycheck to go to a zoo and raise animals. And I hear people griping about zoos, and I hold people holding zoos up with praise. And I can tell you, if you have a zoo person on here, they're going to tell you the good and the bad, because the thing that's common to all 4 of those realms is that they have positives and negatives. None of them are perfect. They all live on this continuum where if we were able to create a Venn diagram and get all the positives from each of those 4 sectors to kind of coalesce, I think herpetoculture would be an unstoppable force for good. But the problem is there is going to be tribalism whenever you have tribes, and those are 4 distinct tribes. So you've got ego that gets thrown into the mix, and you've got to deal with that. And we've all heard the ego from everybody. The academics will have a tendency to look at herpetoculture and go, well, that's not real science. They have a sample size of 4 corn snakes. Like, what you need 30 corn snakes, and you need replication, and you need the snakes at multiple sites. But then when you look at it through the eyes of the zookeeper who might be doing that science, that's a tremendous amount of money to get that amount of replication. And that's money you could be putting into something else that also needs conservation attention, or needs to be, put on display to foster public appreciation. And then, the conservationists, they're, in my mind, they're the people that are absolutely, if there was an enemy to herpetoculture, they are our sworn enemy right now. And I understand why that perspective can be seen, but you're not you're like looking at this a millimeter deep. You're not actually digging into why the regulations are happening. Like, they are happening in response to something. And that something that is the cause of the response is people having animals escape, having spitting cobras get loose in Raleigh, and then all over social media. Like, the public wants a response to that. And a conservation agency can't go, well, we're just going to throw our hands up and not respond. So, it's just this giant heterogeneous soup. And I am in the middle of it, which is really interesting, because I can see literally, all these different places. And I've tried to figure out ways to articulate this, and I have no idea how to do it. So anyway. but yeah, I just wish that there was a way to get all the actors to the table, because in the end, what do we all want? All 4 of those actors want amphibians and reptiles to be celebrated. That's what they all want.
100%.
So if you could just get on, if you could just get people to the table to have that conversation and figure out how they could all be used, and we take the ego out and we like do this all for good, but that's a very utopian viewpoint, and I don't know if that will ever happen in reality. So there's your soup.
I mean,
all right, everybody. So this was episode 33. And, that was very well said and very concise distillation of the central tension at the heart of herpetoculture right now.
Yeah. Right. I mean, there's so much about, I feel like this is something that gets a lot of mixed when I try to, I mean, I have in the past tried unsuccessfully to get other guests to comment on that soup, and I've had some responses from some individuals that say something like, well, I don't really think there's a real conflict between any of these different involved parties. And then you get the whole opposite end of the spectrum, where you get people who say, no, there's a massive conflict between all of them, as you just articulated. And I was wondering if maybe you could take some of that description like a step further, and let's say if you could, I mean, tell me if I'm maybe barking up the wrong tree, but
No,
if
sure.
you could give like the best case or the steelman argument for each of those individual parties, say the conservationist, the private herpetoculturist, the scientists and researchers, and then the zookeepers. Maybe that's too much all at once, but
No.
let's say if you are in the middle, because you are in the middle of all those things, how would you break down the argument from each of those 4 points of view, either for or against herpetoculture, if you were in there? Yeah.
So we'll save the private hobbyist for last.
Okay.
So the conservationist job, the state herpetologist, and there's 50 plus of them across our country. Well, their job is to quite literally manage a statewide fauna and do everything they can to preserve it. Their sole purpose in being and existing at the state level is to go out and monitor these populations of animals, make sure they're okay, and then if they're not okay, identify vectors of decline. They're also, tasked with trying to increase habitat quality and basically protect the resource. And I'm doing air quotes because that's what agency biologists use. And here in West Virginia, rattlesnakes and frogs are a resource. Snapping turtles are because you can eat them. But that's not why our state herpetologist, who's a wonderful person, is doing what he's doing. He's doing what he's doing because he wants to protect and conserve these animals that we love.
Yeah.
So you have to then view potential vectors of imperilment. And whether we like it or not, large numbers of reptiles being kept in a facility represent a potential vector of imperilment. That doesn't mean they're a vector, but they represent that. They can be an island of disease. One of the things is, like, everybody talks about with the Burmese pythons, how they're being sensationalized. And I agree to that. Like, you have a 20-foot snake loose in Florida. That's a good showy headline, and it's going to become a big, gnarly news story. But I know that the conservationists that are the boots on the ground biologists are, they're concerned about the pythons for the pythons, but this parasite that the Burms brought with them, that's called a pentastome, which is actually a weird crustacean that came from Asia, that is infecting a tremendous number of Florida snakes. Those snakes don't have any kind of immunity to that parasite. And this thing gets in the lungs. It's huge. It causes inflammation. It causes cortisol to spike. The animals get sick. Like, that's just as concerning with the Burmese pythons as the fact that they're eating the marsh rabbits and they're huge and blah, blah, blah. And that penistone can travel right up the coast. We don't need Burmese pythons to do that. They can jump from snake to snake to snake to snake to snake once it leaves its host. So if you're a conservation biologist, that might be what you envision with the Burmese pythons. Like, that's a huge threat. You see what I'm, and how many times have you heard people in herpetoculture acknowledging pentastomes?
This is
Like-
this I tend to be a little bit of an ignorant dummy when it comes to this, but this is the first time I've ever heard of that. I had no idea.
Yeah, so that's a big deal. And I work with a guy at Dr. Bogan, who's with the Central Florida Zoo, and he's a amazing herp vet. And he has done necropsies on all kinds of native snakes. And he's pulling these things out of our native snakes like crazy. So that is a threat. Like, so a conservation biologist, when they say, okay, we're not going to have any new animals imported into Florida, which is one of the rules. One of the reasons why they're saying that is we literally have a case of imported animals that escaped in the 90s, got out, brought their parasites with them, and that's now impacting native reptiles and amphibians. That, to me, is a reason to consider putting some kind of regulation in place, because we don't want that to happen again.
Right.
And I don't think that that's horrible.
No,
I love Florida king snakes. A lot of people that listen to my podcast know I'm a geek when it comes to those things. Florida kings have this penistome in them. Like, it's been pulled out of there. They already have development, which probably kills just far more animals than anything. But at the same time, this parasite, to me, is what's scary about a Burmese python. So like, from that conservation point of view, that's the kind of thing they need to be thinking about. Another thing with the conservationists, this is real world. Wood turtles in West Virginia are, I'm not going to mention where they're at, but we have some pretty stable populations. And the wood turtle biologists have done haplotype mapping, which is where you take DNA out of all the wood turtles and you can basically get a genetic signal for geography. And I cannot tell you the number of wood turtles that I am housing at this university that were intercepted at airports on their way to Asia. And when you do the DNA fingerprinting of those wood turtles, they're coming back to the Potomac watershed of West Virginia. And those wood turtles are being taken out of the wild to go to Asia. And the perspective of the conservationist is herpetoculturalists are doing this. Now, this is where the private hobbyists of the world, if we got our act together and weren't so like rah all the time, and we just had conversations that were lucid and showed these people we're respectable, we're knowledgeable, we're not ignorant people, we're passionate, and we have the best interest of these wonderful animals at heart, and had a conversation and said, yeah, that dirtbag that caught the wood turtles needs to go to jail, but I'm breeding wood turtles. I'm willing to take a certain percentage of the money I raise, give it to your state, give it to West Virginia in this case, to foster wood turtle conservation research. I really don't think that our herpetologist is going to look at herpetoculturists the wrong way. But if we have this immediate inflammatory response of, liberty, don't take my rights away, don't do this, don't do that, it just creates this antagonism that's totally unnecessary. Yeah. So, one of the nice things about me having all these hats is that I tell everybody, yes, I am Dr. Loughman, I'm doing air quotes if you're listening, but I'm also Zach that has a crap load of snakes in his garage. You know what I mean? And that message kind of gets through. Okay, well, there are responsible people doing this. So I just wish we could take a step back and kind of look at it. But that's like the conservation angle. Okay. And a lot of times, those conservation biologists got their start by keeping a crested gecko or a turtle. Like, they have a tie to us. Right. That if you can navigate the conversation in the right way, you can open up a dialogue that leads to good positivity. But unfortunately, there's just this really gnarly response to it. So that's like the kind of conservation angle. The zoo people, they're amazing at producing animals, but what a lot of people don't realize about zoos is it's a bureaucracy. It's not a hobby to these people, it's their damn job. So they have to follow a protocol. To be AZA certified, you have to be inspected, you have to have record keeping, you have to do all of this stuff. And one of the things you got to do is you got to like pay for the sins of the past. And it's a well-known aspect of the history of our discipline that zoos in the 70s and 80s did some pretty shady stuff. So, and it's almost celebrated in certain circles of herpetoculture. But at the same time, the way that you pay for those sins is you make far more tomistoma, the false gharials, than you could ever hope to make in Burma. And then, in Borneo, and then you take those tomistoma back. So like the zoos are kind of the professional side, in my opinion, of herpetoculture. But what ends up happening is private hobbyists, I'm guilty of this as well, will look at zoos and be like, well, I can do that better. We all do it.
Oh yeah.
Why do we have to do that? Like, why can't you be like, oh wow, it's really cool what you're doing. Here's what I do. Oh, well, here's what I do. And just have a freaking conversation. Why do we have to always freaking one up each other? It's ridiculous. So, and then where the private hobbyist fits in is all the above. We don't have the bureaucratic oversight, as long as we can keep the damn reptiles. So there's that in the first place. But then we're passion driven, and passion gets you really far in life. It's got me to where I am today. And we are funding this ourselves. So when we get an animal and we put our heart and soul into that animal, the good side of herpetoculture, we can do great things. We dedicate entire parts of our house to these things. We build buildings outside. We are self-funded, so we don't have to compete with the money at the zoo that they have to give to the chimps one day. Like all of my money's going to the snakes in my house. Like that's it. Except for my mortgage and bills and raising my child. But other than that,
those incidental expenses on the margin.
Whatever.
But that passion-driven aspect, the other thing that we do is we breed these things and we sell them. And to some conservation-minded folks, that's cringy. And to some zoo and academic-minded folks, that's cringy. But if we have these captive bred offspring, one of the things I would love to see in my lifetime is a show like one of the NARBCs or Daytona, or like the really big shows, just making the entry like $5 more, which if you're going to the show, you're going to spend $5. You're about to drop $1,000 on a snake. You can spend $5 more to get through the door. Yeah. And you do that to every single person. And then they pick some conservation project in the United States. I don't like gopher tortoises or Louisiana pine snakes or Kirtland snakes, a snake that's not even in herpetoculture, and then basically identify a need financially, and then boom, here you go. You could, and then hold them accountable. Basically say, we're giving you the money, you have to produce something for YouTube or something that can be publicly consumed, showing how these dollars were used for conservation. And then that's how I always talk about the double purple hippopotamus corn snake. Okay. Like that has nothing to do with conservation in any way. But if they cost $600 and you give $100 towards the Kirtland Snake Research Fund, now that corn snake's having a direct impact on conservation. So that's what we can do. We can basically fund this endeavor. And then the other thing that we can do is we can inspire people to become conservation biologists. I kept box turtles and anoles and all those things. And that's literally that like intimate tie to nature. That's what kept me going through all the math classes that I failed to ultimately get to the point that I could be a biologist and do what I do today. So, I know this is like all over the place. No. But I think it should be all over the place because it's messy as hell. There is not a black-white answer. This is a gray, purgatory, heterogeneous soup. But
Right.
if we did it the right way, it could all be done for good. Like there's totally a way for
Yeah.
this to be done for good.
Yeah. It's like a giant multi-circled Venn diagram.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Because like I'm not really aware of any ways that any of these people or places don't overlap in various ways, like I've never, you said it best, like a lot of conservationists sort of got their start by keeping a crested gecko or keeping a bearded dragon or something like that. And all of a sudden that, it just snowballs for them and sends them, on this whole other trajectory. And it is true. It's interesting that there's so many, I never quite considered it in that way, that they're all sort of so intertwined and interrelated and interdependent in some ways, I guess. Are there like similar or sort of related industries or fields that you can point to that maybe have done a better job of this, or maybe that have set an example somewhere, or even if it's unrelated, or is there some other alternate, like maybe with ants?
Well,
I don't know,
there's actually a subset of herpetoculture, ironically, that is in my mind, the archetype of what herpetoculture could be, and it already exists. It's turtles. There's the Turtle Survival Alliance, TSA, which a lot of the people that are doing that work are private hobbyists, and you have zookeepers and you have state agencies. And to me, it is the like archetype amalgamation of what this could be, and it already exists. And if we could just get that model to bounce to snakes, frogs, everything else, it would be great. But in that world, what happens is, there's the turtle crises in Asia and places like that, and you have all these confiscations happening. And when you have a confiscation happen, it's not like 10 turtles, it's 500 sometimes, it's 1,000. And now we have those animals, you can't necessarily put them back in the wild, but they can now serve as founders for preservation, a captive population that then can serve essentially almost like an ARC population. ARC populations, when you bring a wild population into human care to protect it, and then that population produces offspring, which can be released back to the wild. And this has been done with I can't say this genus right, Corora, the Asian box turtles. There's several instances where those have been confiscated. They've been disseminated across multiple private hobbyists and zoos. So this is where private hobbyists and zoos are both working in synergy. Like it can totally be done. And then you have the academics and the conservationists in there who are basically getting the grants to take the animals back, and then seeing with reintroductory science, like what happens when you take a Malaysian box turtle that's been plucked from the wild and then been in human care for 4 years and take it back to its native range. Like what happens when you release that thing? Is it doomed to just wander the landscape, or does it kind of fit back into its niche space and it's a functional animal, on the in the ecosystem? But I don't think we have to look outside of our own house. I think we just look over to the turtle room and model what they're doing. I hold the turtle side of herpetoculture in great esteem, because the other thing that they have done is they have realized that they are not each other's enemy, but they are literally all serving the same purpose, and they've kind of played to each part of the Venn diagram strengths. And they are also willing to identify each level's weakness and be okay with that. You do not have to be good at everything. That's why we collaborate.
Right.
As a scientist, you give me 2 + 2 is 6. Half the time I add them together. I cannot do math, but I can do ecology till I'm blue in the face, and I can look at models and graphs and all that. But you got to give me the graph. So I collaborate with my other researchers that are amazing at doing the math. And we play to each other's strengths. That's what scientists do. That's not what we do in private herpetoculture. We flame each other. We let the ego kind of drive things far too often. But I also think that we have a tendency to kind of say that everybody does that, and I don't think everybody in herpetoculture does that.
No, I don't.
I think there's a tremendous amount of repressed nerddom in herpetoculture. Like I was a 90s kid, and this whole celebration of being a geek, that did not exist when I was growing up.
Yeah.
I dwelled in the shadows and tried to avoid literally being destroyed because I was the nerdy snake kid, if that makes sense. So I was kind of taught to just be quiet and be, introverted and just stay in my lane. And if we were to kind of celebrate this and kind of get that, get these kind of common grounds where we can all go to and figure this whole thing out and discuss these things, I think it would be nothing but good. So I am, believe it or not, pretty damn hopeful.
Yeah.
I don't think if we're pessimistic, we're not, there's no sense in even doing this. Like, it's just a matter of everything aligning and people being willing to discuss. But like I said, turtle people have already done it.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I think so. The conversation we had with Alan Rapashi kind of got me thinking about something like this, which is if you take morph stuff, let's put morphs on one end of this. Let's just put that over here on a table, right? Because I'm cool with morphs. Let's just leave them over here for a minute.
Yeah.
You take that out of the picture. I feel like a lot of like the infighting and bashing. Well, actually, let's take morphs and venomous and we'll put it over here.
Yeah.
If you take that stuff out of the picture, a lot of the fighting and a lot of the grumpiness and the all of that stuff seems to kind of happen. So Alan mentioned it used to be that we're all reptile and amphibian keepers.
Yes.
Now we're divided in these little sub tribes, right? And I think a lot of the fighting actually happens within those little tribes. It's like one, leopard gecko keeper who's grumpy with another, right? One ball python keeper who's grumpy with another for their behaviors. But then it seems to me that like the highest level keepers in each individual tribe, or even just the people who are very, very interested or dedicated, tend to have interests that have them looking over the fence at other people working with other like I'm looking over at Roy and what he's doing with his animals and being like, Jesus Christ, like I don't have I have no idea. Honest, I really mean that. Like I have no idea how Roy does what he does. And I mean, it's just, he's obviously doing a great job, but I feel like that nerdiness that you're talking about really does seem to be everywhere. Like everyone who's doing this in a way that they're very passionate and very, very interested tend to be really interested in what other people are, when other people are doing cool shit. And it's not even just within herpetoculture. It's like, I'm interested in all this other crazy shit too. I'm really, really interested. I'm intrigued by what you do in your work with Crayfish. Like, I don't know anything about, I've known nothing about them other than what I've heard you talk about on other podcasts and stuff like that. It's fascinating. I'm interested in people who are keeping birds, people who are, I'll even go so far as to say it. I'm interested in people keeping arachnids, even though I have not a shred of interest in that. You know what I'm saying? Like, and one of the people who made me really reconsider some of that was one of our other guests, which was Nathan Carlos Rupley, who was describing the way he was interpreting what was it, Roy? I think it was
a tailless whip scorpion.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, tailless whip scorpion. And I was just like, man, I've been looking at this. I've been just working with these blinders on, again, and I obviously put venomous and morphs on the side because I think one of the unifying things among all of those folks is you have some people who are like, morphs are evil and people shouldn't be free handling, triple venomous frappuccino snakes. I'm just joking around, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you shouldn't be doing that. And all right, I'm here to talk about whatever with regard to that, but I kind of lost my train of thought. I very much enjoyed what you said about that, because that is true, that even though there is a lot of bashing and infighting, I really do think that, you see it, right? You could see it just in follows on the phone, right? You look at the people who you think are doing the best at what they do, and then you look at who they're following and paying attention to and commenting on, they're commenting on other badasses doing really, really cool shit. Yeah.
That's a really good insight.
Not fully formed thought, but had to throw that out there.
No, I love it. I mean, I think that's so true. I often feel, for me, like, I mean, yeah, I'm an absolute geek about all of this stuff. And that includes like stuff that I have never kept and
Yeah.
know I will probably never keep. I still love reading about it. I still love deep diving on Google Scholar and learning everything I can about it. And for me, it's like it's a pleasure to enjoy those tacks of vicariously through the people who are killing it with them. You know, it's like you with your mastics, and like, you know, Max and Connor with like Thrassops and all these cool African colubrids that I'm like, those are awesome snakes, but like, I'm not going there right now. I can't do it. I don't have the space. You know, and on and on and on. I think that is, that can be such a merit in herpetoculture, is that we can kind of be each other's cheerleaders, even if we're not necessarily on the same team.
Yep. And then the other thing is, if you think about just human nature, whenever you listen to anybody that is talking about anything, I mean, it can be different types of screws and nails, which to me are boring. But if you have someone that has dedicated their life to screws and nails, and they pick up that screw or that nail and they're like, oh no, but you don't know about this one, and they've got that like energy. That energy is what's infectious. And there's an authenticity to that energy. Like, you can't just, like, if you hand me a screw or a nail, I'm gonna be like, it's a Phillips head. That's it. That's the energy. It's made of metal. I don't know what kind of metal, but
Zach, it's hot dipped galvanized, man.
There you go. See, I don't know any of this stuff. But if you are just, you know, you just kind of let her rip, and you are willing to put yourself out there and geek out, you can't deny that this is what I have learned studying of all things crayfish. We can bring crayfish in a little bit.
Yeah, let's bring
I cannot tell you the number of people who are like, you study bait? I'm like, no. They are bait, but there's 400 freaking species in North America. They fulfill all these different niches, sorry. And, you know, there's burrowers, there's species that live in big rivers. There's some that are an inch long. There's some that are 10 inches long. They are every color of the rainbow. There's some that are predators, some that are herbivores. And if I start like going, and I'm doing one of my outreach events for crayfish, I've learned that just the energy, it's not the facts, it's the energy that you're giving off. That's what's infectious. And you can't fake that. And if we were to get everybody at the table and you all represent your tribes, and instead of putting up your walls, you let that rip and geek out, that's when people have a tendency, I think, that have bureaucratic power or whatever, to be like, okay, maybe there is something to this crazy snake guy.
Yeah.
You know, but what ends up happening is, when we have legislation and things like that, we have these public meetings, and what's the point of a public meeting? It's to go in there and to defend your tribe. So you don't get to geek out in a positive way. You're on a defense. So the energy spin is completely wrong. So like, maybe if you were dealing with the person making the law, we might want to get in there and talk to them directly. And I don't think we need to be talking about like the nuances of keeping a false water cobra with them. But if we just let them know, like, this is not just something we do. This is something that defines us as a community. And that we have knowledge here. And not only do we have knowledge here, but we are like legitimate. Like, we are doing things well. There's two things to kind of jump off this that kind of drive me crazy. This is the only time that I get like in my ivory tower. So now I'm putting on my douchebag academic cap. Remember how I said I wear a lot of hats? Everybody. I can wear that hat. One of the things that drives me insane, I mean, I do full body cringes while I'm listening to things in my car, is when we say the hobby, because this is so much more than a freaking hobby. This is a discipline. Like, this is not a hobby. If you think about it, if you have 5 corn snakes and you're booping their snoots, which is totally fine. That's what you want to do. And you have them and you're keeping them. You have no intentions of breeding them, no intentions of maintaining a line. you just want to have pets, that's a hobby. What's going on in my garage is discipline. I have like busted my ass to get false water cobras from as many different sources as I can. I've read up about the phenotypes in nature, which was really difficult to do. So I have a general idea. It's a hypothesis of where these things came from based off what I've read. I've figured out, like, I've kept dedicated notes. I figured out what I have to do to breed these things. I've looked at the different temperatures I'm incubating eggs at. I've reared my babies on quail, on mice, on rat pinks, on tilapia, on all the above, on some of the above. I've done all of this to maximize growth. That's not a freaking hobby. That's an obsession, and that's a discipline. And if you're talking about people that are judging us and we refer to it as a hobby, when you say hobby, no offense if you do this, I picture baseball cards and comic books and stuff like that. And you don't need that to live. And technically we don't need the snakes and everything to live. But, you know, we could take our skill set and then kick it over to Louisiana pine snakes and help preserve them. You can't necessarily do that if you're keeping a comic book.
As a comic book nerd, I am deeply offended.
Yes.
No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I'm a comic book nerd as well. So
yeah, no, I'm just playing around.
So good.
Okay, so you said some really, really interesting things there that I want to break up more, because considering you are as a self-proclaimed avid listener of the show, you've heard me discuss herpetoculture as an art and as like it resembles martial arts, right?
Yes.
And I feel like no matter what, even though there is one of the interesting and defining features of martial arts, and I think Eric Haycraft may disagree with me on this because of his chosen way of defining martial art, combat sports as something else, right? So maybe that's for another day. But like, one of the defining features of martial arts is it has profound cultural utility, but it doesn't necessarily have like the same kind of real world application. Or, I mean, it does. I mean, I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like, if there's anything that has real world application, like wrestling, chokes, and boxing, that has real world application, right? So I'm not saying it doesn't have real world application, but if I was a hunter gatherer, I'm not sure what utility to get out of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? And so if we're going to talk about herpetoculture as something that is a discipline, and yet we're also going to have this sort of area of herpetoculture that is also like has this real world purpose. I mean, it feels like there's a way that those two things maybe not conflict, but it's a little damn cat. My cat's jacking around with stuff in my room. There's something I have ADD. I'm highly distractible. So, but I don't know if maybe there's something. I feel like there's something here because, you know, I really want. We had one of the podcasts we recorded last week. I was a little intoxicated, and I'm headed there again because I'm drinking sake. But Japanese, man, what do you want from me? But I was kind of getting a little wily about the fact that in some ways it feels as though part of our progression as a discipline, as herpetoculture, is going to have to be, some of it anyway, feels like, and I just want to know what you think about this, Zach. I kind of feel like some of our progress is going to be related to letting go of this idealization or glorification, or putting up on a pedestal the wild type, like we have to acknowledge that we have something very different from a wild animal at some point, right? Well, like, sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's the domestication process,
right?
If you took a pastel, all right. So I'm trying to remember the ball python morph that has the wobble. Is it bumblebee?
Spider.
That's it. I knew it was an arthropod. I just got it wrong.
There you go.
Spider. You know, we can maintain spiders. There's plenty of spiders alive today. They're living in human care, and I'm not getting into the ethics. I'm just using that as an example. If you take that morph and you put it out into Ghana, where there's ball pythons, evolution's going to kick back in, natural selection is at play, and that thing's going to be eliminated. But
Mhm.
we like the way they look, so we have artificial selection acting on those organisms because we are the evolutionary force.
Yeah.
We are protecting all the mechanisms of death from those natural mechanisms. They're out of the equation. So because of that, we are maintaining those organisms in human care. And result of that, there's going to, with this morph breeding and the line breeding and all that kind of thing, we are kind of, it's no different than dogs.
Yeah.
We're kind of getting
Mhm.
into this kind of weird artificial representation of what our taxa are. Just most of the animals in herpetoculture have not had the generation time yet to really see the phenotypic manifestation of that, is what we would call it. There are definitely some leopard geckos, crested geckos, bearded dragons, ball pythons, even boa constrictors. There's plenty. And with that, what we will ultimately have will not be a locality. I love locality animals. Literally right next to me are Hernando County Florida king snakes because I love that look. But if I keep breeding the Hernando line that's in human care, it's still selective breeding, whether we want to call it that or not. I am breeding.
Yeah.
There are the founding stock of those animals is maybe 10 king snakes. And that whatever the hell the genes were for those 10 king snakes are what Hernando County is going to be for Florida king snakes and herpetoculture.
Yeah.
So, there is a little bit of a disingenuous aspect of that. And you can see this already, like jungle carpet pythons are a great example. When we say that here in the States, we think about an animal that is jet black and neon yellow, because that's what a jungle carpet is to us.
Okay.
In the wild, there's a huge phenotypic plasticity to that animal.
Right.
So that's a locality. But at the same time, we have our representation of that locality, and then there's nature's version of that locality. And in that regard, herpetoculture is going to have its own definition of what that is. That's not going to be the same thing. That is what is out in nature. And I do think that has to be recognized.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, so man, this is awesome. I have so much in this that I feel bad because unfortunately there's some stuff that I'm going to forget because I just have a very poor short-term attention. But we talk about stuff. You mentioned the ball python, right? It's like, oh, you take a spider ball python, you throw it out in Ghana, it's going to die, or at least we assume that's what's going to happen.
We assume it's going to die.
But we cite dogs. If you look at dogs, pigs, cows, chickens, any other cats, any other domestic animal. I mean, I'm sure that obviously there's some, like the dog breeds that can't even give natural birth that won't manage out in the wild. But then there's a small subset of ones that do great, then do just fine out, especially depending on where you are. Like if you live in the Caribbean, you're going to get potcake dogs, which are just this weird mashup of dogs that all just stray dogs that all kind of became a thing there, right? If you go to what is it, something, what I don't know what the exact metrics are on this, but the wild hog population in the United States is like it's like they're pigs from Spain or something that were it was like a tiny...
they're domesticated pigs. But what's crazy about things like pigs, and most animals will do this, is they kind of revert back to this natural phenotype that's not natural but natural. That's what dingoes are an example of that.
Exactly. Right. So when we I think this is a really confounding variable when we talk about the utility of herpetoculture, because people will say, I'll be the first to say that when you bring animals from the wild into captivity, that you're changing them. But it doesn't mean that there's not, I mean, we are an artificial selector, as you said yourself, but we are also, but there is something, like I would imagine if I bred my Euros for 100 years in captivity and you took them and you threw them out in the deserts of Israel, surely some of them are going to make and do great. They're just going to rip. Maybe they have like 2 left feet or something. I don't know, but like, but I feel like I just feel like this there's all these hypothetical discussions that we have around what would and wouldn't be viable in the wild. And there's this glorification of like the wild type and the naturalistic perspective. And I'm here for that. Like, I'm not trying to poo-poo that, but I don't think we really know. I feel like there are all these ways we do talk about this in a hypothetical way, but it's pure speculation, right? At least on some level.
Well, that's where science becomes pretty cool.
I do like science.
If you do this if you approach, and I'm not saying this can be interpreted as an elitist doctrine. It is not an elitist doctrine. I'm just simply saying if you approach herpetoculture through this aspect of science, you just don't care. Like you have your founding stock, and you're going to do what you can to maintain that line of animals in human care. But if you're doing it well, you got to inevitably introduce some new blood, because you're going to end up with inbreeding issues. Now, one of the really weird, interesting things, and this is something that I've been kind of diving into, is with a lot of reptiles and amphibians, there's a lot of evidence that you get what we call a founder event. So that's when, like, let's just say you have a Caribbean island off the northern coast of South America somewhere, and it doesn't have any snakes or lizards living on it. And then you get a hurricane, and then that hurricane deposits through animals that get washed out to sea. 3 gravid boa constrictors just serendipitously end up on that island. Those animals have what it takes to then establish a boa constrictor population. And if you think about it, that's really not that different than somebody going and plucking 3 gravid boa constrictors out of an importer bin and starting a line in captivity. So this is something that I've thought about, but does that mean it's right? I'm certain that that population would probably do better if it had genes, more genetic continuity, or would it? So when you're a scientist, you take the emotion and the subjectivity and all that out of it, and you just ask if-then type questions. And that's one of the things I really want to know about personally, is I just want to understand this whole idea of inbreeding in herpetoculture. And I am not saying it is right, and I'm not saying it is wrong. I don't think we understand it. I don't think we truly get what's going down.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Because there are examples in nature. One of the things that's absolutely fascinating to me, like, this is crazy, is if you know anything about crocodiles in the Americas, people didn't know where the genus Crocodilus came from for the longest time in North Central South America. They could not figure it out. Somebody found a skull of a crocodile from the Cenozoic that they were able to get DNA out of from Northern Africa, and they put that into a phylogenetic tree and figured out that American crocs came from crocodiles that swam across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa. It's like one of the only examples of that kind of faunal exchange. I'm sorry, there are not thousands of crocodiles swimming across the Atlantic Ocean. That's not happening.
Wow.
And if that's true, the founder event for the Morlets, Cuban, Orinoco, and American croc could have been like 5 animals from Africa.
Right. It's like,
you know what I'm saying? So, like, but is that the norm? Is that not the norm? So when you do science, you don't say this is the way. You just keep going where the evidence takes you.
Right.
And that's something that in herpetoculture, that doesn't happen, because people say this is how you do it. And then this person over here says, well, this is how you do it. And then this person over here says, no, this is how you do it. Right. And then that ego thing that I'm talking about. Ego, it's toxicity. It can shut down conversations. If those 3 people said, well, I do it this way. Well, I do it this way. Well, I do it this way. Well, I'm going to challenge your way by doing this, and you challenge my way. That's what we should be doing. You do what I do and see if it's as good. That's what scientists do. What, but we don't do that. The whole rack debate is kind of interesting, because there was a time where I was emphatically anti-rack. I was completely, totally emotional about it. Said there's no room for racks in herpetoculture. It's cruel. It's horrible. It's bad. And then I became the the curator of 400 reptiles and amphibians from multiple species and found out there is absolutely a purpose for a rack. When I have a snake that needs quiet, calm, lack of stimulation to get established, there's nothing better than a rack. But then you have people that'll even say in that situation, racks are horrible. You shouldn't do that. And it's an individual, deal. We have water pythons here. Great example. And we have a water python. I want that thing to live in a 6 foot long, 3 foot wide, 2 foot tall PVC enclosure with naturalistic everything. It won't do anything in there except for try to kill everything, go off of food and lose weight. But I put it back into the V70 rack tub, which to me is cringy, and that thing eats, it puts on weight, it maintains everything. So, in this situation, student of the serpent, I'm letting the snake tell me what it wants. But if I tell people I'm keeping this 5 foot snake in a V70 tub,
how dare you?
I'm the devil. So and that's that whole toxicity thing. Now, ultimately, I try not to keep things in racks. And we've done some experiments here that clearly demonstrate you add more heterogeneity to an enclosure and you give the animals choice, they go to where the heterogeneity is, like all the time. But you can also have a rack and have heterogeneity. There are definitely going to be a handful of critters out there that may do great in a rack, but we can't have that conversation because racks are bad. The end, done. You see what I'm saying? So but then the flip side to that is the rack keepers of the world, the second something comes out that shows racks are positive, they latch onto that. And now see, racks are great. So, the reality of this is there's just so much freaking nuance to this stuff. It's all gray. It's not black and white. And we just have to figure it out. You know what I mean? But if we get in our silos and start yelling at each other and putting down each other and, the tribalism and all that, it's just totally unnecessary.
No, you're totally right, man. You're totally right about all that stuff. I mean, I feel like I do have an optimistic feeling that this does appear to be changing.
It does
to a certain degree. Like it really does feel as though some of these reactive behaviors and trends in herpetoculture, again, I mean, who am I? I mean, I don't necessarily have my finger on the pulse of the whole industry or anything like that, but it does. The more people I speak with, the more people seem to be more interested and open-minded. I mean, I feel like a huge number of the guests we've had on this show have exhibited that, where they're like, you know what, I feel like I don't really have a hard line on any of this stuff. No. There have been a few, obviously my friend Cam and I have he and I differ a lot on the way we view morph and hybridization especially in uromastics, because that's the thing that he and I are most passionate about. So I mean, I get it. We differ on that, and it's fine. It's fair. I hope you guys don't mind. I want to back up just a smidge,
sure,
because what you mentioned about founder events, I've thought about. I mean, I don't have a lot of scientific background on this particular topic, but I have, I've thought a lot about Fiji for a long time. Like, how many goddamn iguanas made it to fucking Fiji? How many?
Yep.
You tell me how many, and you show me where the inbreeding depression is, goddamn it, but I have anecdotal evidence of herping in certain parts of the American Southwest because I'm a huge fan of chuckwallas. And I can give you 2 examples of places I know, one in which it's a tiny 10 by 10 foot rock pile that is so goddamn far from the nearest mountain range, and there is a thriving population of chuckwallas on that 10 by 10 foot rock pile. And you're going to tell me that there's free gene exchange between that rock pile and the nearest hillside? Bullshit. I'm sure it happens, but it can't be that often, right? There's another example of human intervention, a very particular mountain range where a bulldozer, this is why the small rock pile that is like a mile away from the nearest hillside even is more confounding, because this other example in my mind here is an example where a bulldozer, they blasted a road between two at the end of a mountain range, a small mountain range in this habitat. They bulldozed a road right between the main body of the range and the little end of the mountain range. And what wouldn't you know it, there's a lot of inbreeding going on that hillside because we found albino chuckwallas there in the wild, like a thriving little population of animals. It's two little hillside. I mean, it's just, that's obviously what's happening, you know, and none of the animals have a problem. They're fine. We found babies. My friend found an adult female. We found juveniles, all albino, living on the wild in this damn rock pile. And you get to, oh hell no, morphs. Oh, no way, no, morphs they're not good. They'd never, an albino would never live in the wild. Well, bullshit. They live and breed in the wild, right? It's like that. But then when you see the realities of what we call inbreeding, depression, and captivity, my mind starts to run over and over and over like, okay, maybe this has nothing to do with genetic diversity. Maybe this has to do with all these other factors that we have not unwound at all. Maybe this has to do with nutrition. Maybe this has to do with microbiota. Maybe this has to do with whoa, shit. I lost my train of thought. But you know what I'm saying? Like, maybe there's so many other things that could be the factor here that, you know.
The other thing, though, is that it could also be species by species by species by species.
Right, sure, right.
Yeah.
Like chucks, maybe with chucks and iguanas, it's no big deal, but you do it to a Euromastix and they shit.
And this is where understanding natural history and life history becomes super helpful.
Yeah.
To kind of tease these things apart, because, you know, generation time and all that kind of good stuff, that all has to be kind of taken into the mix to figure out what exactly is going on. Like when we have morphs, we see the paint job. We don't see the enzymes that are on the co-adapted gene sequences that make it so their brains don't fire as effectively. And I will fully admit, I'm not the biggest fan of morphs. It could totally be a case where you get a morph and the enzyme's more efficient. You have to acknowledge that you could have a positive.
Yep. You have one without the other.
Just kind of understanding that. But here again, taking a line where we're not going to demonize, but we're going to learn.
Yeah.
Right. That's what's important. There's a curator. I'm going to give him a shout out. Robert Mendick. He's at the Audubon Zoo in New Orleans, and he has written extensively about this whole idea of folklore husbandry, which I love. Yes. I feel like we need to talk about this more.
Robert Mendick.
Than we do. Yes, Mendick. Robert Mendick. And with folklore husbandry, this is
Mendyk.
Yeah, this is the husbandry. These are the practices that we kind of do out of culture in herpetoculture. And I don't mean like culturing snakes. I mean our human culture. Like the whole idea, like in the 80s, hot rocks were acceptable practice. Today, if you put a hot rock in a cage and anybody with any clout sees that, that is actually room, I would argue, to be like, okay, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah, sure.
But for a while there, that's what we did. You see what I'm saying? Why do we do that? Well, because this is the way we've always done it. We put the animal in there, they use them. Well, now we know, they can short out and get to 250 degrees and cook the lizard.
Yeah.
So, you know what I'm saying? And so what Mendick does is he basically, challenges things and explains this whole idea of folklore husbandry. I don't think he's the guy that came up with it, but he is definitely the person who has written extensively about it. And a lot of what becomes practice and dogma, you could argue, is the folklore husbandry. So what we should be doing is just questioning it. There's nothing wrong in questioning what we're doing, but you shouldn't be flamed for questioning it. And the question can also be, if everybody's saying racks are bad, you are allowed to ask the question, can they be good?
Yeah, for sure.
There's and that's the null hypothesis to the hypothesis that racks are bad. If you're doing this objectively, you test all the hypotheses. You see, And so even when we have our camps and our tribes, and one's preaching this is the way, the other is preaching this is the way, you're not really doing it in a completely objective way. So that's why one of the big things that I teach my students is, evidence-based husbandry. I think, I think some of our dogma is great, but there's nothing wrong with saying, well, why do we cook the eggs at 82 degrees? Why don't we cook them at 80 degrees? So let's go and test that and see. You see? And so that's what we do in my lab a lot is I just sit back and observe. I'm lurking all the time. And I'm taking notes. What are the things that people keep talking about? And then I'm like, okay, I can test that. And so then we test it. The thing is, we haven't published any of this stuff yet. But this is the year. A lot of my graduate students are graduating. But, and I'm not going to give out results. But one of the things that we tested was the whole idea of incubation temperatures. There's this idea in snakes that if you incubate at a lower temperature, you get a more robust baby. But it also takes longer. And then there's this idea, if you incubate at higher temperatures, you get a less robust baby. And then people, if you bring this up, oh, no, you don't need to test that. We know the answer to that. And so we did. And all I have to say is wait for the paper.
I've been looking forward to that one for a while now.
I got to get Taylor to write her
the
thesis.
works.
She has to turn it into me in 3 weeks. So
Awesome.
There you go. But the results are definitely in. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Oh,
awesome.
Man. Exciting. That's
very
so, but that's, I think that we need more of that in herpetoculture. And I think that shaming people, let's just stop that. We don't need that. Because what happens when you get shamed? You put up a guard, you get defensive, and you shut down that person because you're an asshole. Well, they may be an asshole, they may not be an asshole, but we don't need to do that. We just don't need to do that. So anyway, and that's the educator in me. If I walked into my classroom and started with, y'all are idiots. I mean, imagine if you're trying to learn and the person who's teaching you leads with, you're a moron. Are you good? What are you going to think about that person? You're not going to listen to them. You're going to spend the first 30 minutes being like, well, this son of a bitch, well, who the hell does he think he is? You see what I'm saying? But if you kind of go in and you just lead with, here's what we're doing today. Here's how we did it. Here's what we found. And some people might say I'm too optimistic, but just kind of change the approach,
we were talking
it might be good. And there are definitely people that do this. I have people that I look up to as mentors where I know I can ask them any question I perceive as stupid, and they're just going to be like, well, let's talk it out and think and see what's going on here. And I think that that's something that we desperately, we need that. And there's definitely areas where that happens, but the loudest voice in the room is the one that is heard. So, that's why we oftentimes talk about what's going on in social media and all that kind of stuff. But there's plenty of people that are, that are willing to have these conversations. You just have to find them. That's the problem.
Yeah. We had a sort of a slightly similar conversation, or a sliver of the conversation anyway, with Eddie Soto, where we were talking about like gatekeeping in culture. Like, man, if you're gonna be that person that you just mentioned, like, what if you walked into your classroom and said, "You listen here, dummies, I'm about to turn," imagine all the people you're gonna turn away. But we really do have to draw a bigger circle, because if we want more people to be involved, we want more people to have a vested interest in what we do, and more people to have a vested interest in conservation and preservation and education and development and politics and what, you name it. You can't start the conversation with, "You dumb newbie, you should have read the care guide." It's like, come on, dude. Like, just take it easy, I know I have more questions, but I've been yelling a lot, and I want to throw the ball to Roy here.
Well, I mean, we're just kind of like, we're just rolling right through the questions I already had, so it's been perfect.
I mean, that's good.
But I mean, you just used this term, evidence-based husbandry.
Yes.
It's something that I hear you use regularly, and I feel like it's it's something I want to unpack a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah. So if you could just give us your definition for this term. I mean, it seems obvious, but I would just want to get real clear, and then go from there. Like, why is it important?
So with evidence-based husbandry, my version of evidence-based husbandry comes from my roots. So I tell everybody that I aspire to be the absolute best naturalist I can be, the most effective educator I can be, and an okay scientist. Because natural history and nature, and science, they are connected, but they also kind of live in their own realm. And natural history is far more important to me than hypothesis testing science, which is where you go out and test a hypothesis. I would much rather say queen snakes, which is a snake that I study here. We aren't testing a particular hypothesis with queen snakes. I tell my students we're going to look at the who, what, when, where, why of queen snakes. So there's a million questions that fall underneath the W's, as I say. So we're just going to attack it all. So kind of taking that approach to nature study, I just kind of was like blip and kind of pivoted to the left and was like, this is how I'm going to keep my animals. But that means that I have to then answer questions like, where does it live? Who does it eat? If it's a predator, who eats it? When does it breed? I'm asking all of these. So I have to go, and then to answer those questions, I need to go and find the data, and the data is the evidence. So for me, that data comes in the form of journal articles, books, Facebook groups, believe it or not. iNaturalist, wonderful resource.
Yeah.
And kind of taking the little bits and pieces and slivers from all those different resources and then amalgamating them together into the evidence that I need to figure out my lighting regime, my feeding regime, what kind of substrate I'm going to use, what are my temperatures, what are my brumating temperatures, am I even brumating, what are my incubation temperatures, how long should the eggs incubate? Like, you can get all of that information with the internet now, or you can also figure out, crap, like this does not exist for this taxa. And so I had my students doing this in my herpetoculture class, and they kept saying, like, kind of like this conversation, you're all over the place. Could you give us some guidance? And I was like, yeah, I can give you some guidance. And so I kind of like thought about it a while. And then that's where the paper that I wrote about evidence-based husbandry came into play, because it literally started off as a paper I was going to write just as a way to show, quite literally like a document that I gave my students so they could write these things that I call a care plan, which I have all my students pick a herp and they have to do this big, massive care plan as one of the class projects. Well, I thought, I am in this kind of position where I am privileged to get paid to write. So why don't I just take this to another level and get a publication that I could kind of share with everybody? So that is like a shameful plug for that paper, but at the same time, it totally outlines exactly what I do. And what I find is this approach to herpetoculture, for me, it is the nerdiest, like, geekiest way of doing this, because you just are swimming in it. You're immersed in every aspect of the animal's biology, and it is nothing but absolute fun. Like, this is the way that I do this, because it's no different. If you go back to the beginning of the episode, this is what I was doing when I was 10. I just had no direction because I was 10. Now I have direction. So I just kind of figured out how to take what was my childhood fascination and kind of put it together in a manner where I can now approach herpetoculture this way. And so the other thing it does is it literally makes it so you learn everything. It creates this and this is where the discipline of herpetoculture comes into play, because you literally learn a method, you learn an approach to gathering your information, to organizing your information, to then implementing the information once you've ascertained the information, and then testing your implementation. And it leads to this kind of, in my opinion, an extremely rewarding process. My favorite snakes on the planet are false water cobras. And I did this with them, and every single year I've learned something new, and then I've just taken that little nugget of information and then put it into the way I've been doing things, because I have this discipline to it, and it reaps benefits. The animals, appear to be healthier. They're reproducing. I'm rearing the young. I'm not losing anything. Like I haven't had a falsie die or an egg fail in the past 2 or 3 years. So, but that's kind of what I do with the evidence-based approach. As far as the evidence itself, if you can, learn how to get the information from the internet, it's easier than people think. There's 2 resources every single person with Wi-Fi has access to. If you can get to Google, if you can get to Google Scholar and you type in the Latin name of your animal, that's usually in the title of an article. And so it'll pop up. And you also need to be able to go back in time and learn the old Latin names of your animals, because, taxonomists like me have this tendency to change things, even though it's supposed to not change.
Yeah.
So, like with Hydrodynastes gigas, the false water cobra, that thing's been in the genus Xenodon. It was in this really weird genus Caligaris. And so you would search, Hydrodynastes gigas, then Xenodon gigas, and you get kind of all the papers. And then the problem is you get these papers and then you're kind of like stuck, because you just get an abstract and you can't actually get the paper. So I am not telling people to go to the website Sci-Hub and take this little thing called a DOI and paste it in there. Don't do that, because you won't be able to get the PDF of the journal if you do that. So there you go. And you can get, it is possible to get that material. You do not have to pay the money. You should, but I've published a lot of peer-reviewed papers in my day, and I've paid to have those things published. And I think it's absolutely sinful that we pay to have this, information sit behind a paywall.
I agree.
So, anywho, but then you can also go to this website called ResearchGate. And ResearchGate, if you don't know what that is, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like Twitter or Instagram for scientists. And when you get a publication, you put it up on your ResearchGate page, and then you can go, and a lot of times you can't put a PDF of your pub up, but you put the article up there, and then there's a contact button. And if you message the biologist, depending on where they are in their career and how busy they are, there's a pretty good probability that they're going to send you the PDF, because we always get copies of that when we publish a paper. And then there's open access now, which is kind of the newer way of doing things, is that lots of journals are now when you publish it. But there's also, one of the things that we desperately need, and we don't have it anymore, is we need a periodical like the Vivarium, and then Old School Reptiles magazine. There's New School Reptiles magazine, and then there's the 90s version. And I love the 90s version. But a lot of those articles are now available online. Like you can actually get those. But Responsible Herpetoculture just kind of popped up. And that's definitely something, like I have every intention of putting some papers in there. Nice. I just need to get some freaking time to write them. That's the problem. But there's plenty of ways to get the information, and then you create your own little library and go from there.
Man,
beautifully said.
Yeah, couldn't agree.
Yeah, I was so excited when you published that paper. I was like, this is basically my exact process.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird. I felt weird publishing it, because a lot of it is what people have done for decades. But no, it's but so at the same time, it just kind of gave order. And exactly. I teach a lot of young people, and I know that like next generation, y'all want that, so why not do it? So that was kind of the
I mean, I don't think no, never mind. Sorry, I was gonna go in.
Well, what I love about that though is just like, I mean, I've said it ad nauseum on here, but it's just that we really need think we need better modes of teaching, like how to do herpetoculture,
Yeah.
you know, from a systematized way,
Yes.
to newcomers that come into the hobby. There's so few outlets that really provide a good overview of like, this is how you figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think it's just so much more empowering, to be able to figure it out for yourself, to feel like, you know, I don't know, I can't find a care sheet on this species, but can I find enough information to feel empowered enough to give it a try, you know,
Yeah.
because there's several species at this point, you know, that I've worked with where it's like, there was no care sheet out there. There's nothing,
Right.
you know, but there's the base information was there enough for me to feel like, okay, I'm going to give it a shot, you know, and
Yeah.
that's been such a rewarding process for me to engage in. And I wish that just more people felt empowered to do that.
And it's a place in which you can really do some true exploration. I
Yeah.
mean,
Exactly.
one of those few areas of the world where it's like, who the hell's kept this thing in captivity before? You know what I mean? It's like, who's had to
Exactly.
work out the inner workings of what they need and how they need it and when they need what. I mean, depending on what it is, the answer very well could be fucking no one.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
like, absolutely nobody.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, shifting gears a little bit, I understand that you've recently completed a book,
Yes.
and that that's
Still
been quite the
twitching, but it's done.
process. Yeah. You're still recovering. You're in the recovery process.
Mhm.
But I'm curious if you could just talk to us a little bit about that process,
Oh yeah.
of doing the book, writing the book, collecting the materials, and also just speaking a little bit to the value of print media,
Mhm.
printed media in the digital age that we're living in. Because I think that, you know, one of the issues that we have is that we're awash in information,
Yes.
and so much of it is poorly vetted information that can just be published by any random guy. But
Yeah.
it's a kind of a different thing to be like, you know, I'm going to write a book on dipsadids and then actually do it. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah. Well,
elucidate the process for us.
so part of that was talking about my many caps is I did not have imposter syndrome. That's not what it was. But I just felt like I was in a space with this, you know, in 2016, ZooSci happens. I'm now doing Herpetoculture 2018. The grad program opens up in ZooSci. I now have Herpetoculture grad students. I wrote the paper on evidence-based husbandry, and there was just kind of this weird emptiness in my world that I needed to fill with something. And I realized that this is where I could write a book. And it was really weird because I got this giant, massive research lab that has hundreds of thousands of dollars of funding to go look at crayfish. And I'm pumping out journal articles and have grad students and, you know, going to meetings with people and representing the crayfish. And I also kind of felt like I was living that meme where there's the guy walking with the girl that's wearing the red shirt and he turns around and looks at the blue. Yeah, the red shirt girl was crayfish. And then I was like, ooh, herpetoculture's over here. So I kind of at first just had to make peace with like, it's okay to do both. So that was the first process for me. And then the other part was I've never written a book before. And I just written that paper, and I was actually talking to Bob Ashley with Eco. And my first wave was like, all right, I love obscure colubroid snakes. And I want to, you know, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to pick one of those. And then I was talking to Bob, and Bob was like, well, we need a hognose book. And I was like, done, I'll do the hognose. And then I thought, and then I'm living the meme again, only now the meme is the red shirted girls, the hognose book. And then there's all these other dipsadids over here from South America, you know? And so I worked it out with Bob where I was going to write the complete guide to hognose snakes and their allies. And so I thought I'll write the allies part first. And then when I had written 100 pages and was only 2 chapters in, I realized this hognose book's going to be 1,000 pages long. This is not okay. I need to write the Dipsadded book to learn how to do it, because the Hognose book is a much bigger, it's going to have a much wider audience. And I don't want to, like, my freshman effort has to be like niche. You can't get more niche than xenodontid snakes in South America. Like, you know, and that's where my passion in herpetoculture has ended up. So Bob didn't want to publish that book. So then I had to go and find somebody who wanted to publish that book. And I was looking at self-publishing it through Amazon, because I talked to one of my mentors. I don't know if he knows he's my mentor, but he's definitely someone I look up to, who's Justin Julander, because we're kind of in this same space. And he published the Green Tree Python book through Amazon. And I could do that, but I wanted somebody that could kind of mentor me on this process. And so I knew about Russ Gurley, who's an awesome guy. He actually does the layout for a lot of the I don't think all of the eco books. And so I knew Bob didn't want this book after some conversations with him, because he said, like, no one's going to buy it. And I was like, okay, that's fine. And so I talked to Russ, and by that point I had the thing like 80% written in the first draft, and I sent it to him. And Russ, I love that man, because he was just like, yeah, I'll do this. And I was like, it's that easy? It's like, no, I'll do this. This is good. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, no, we're doing that. Like, it was one of those things where, like, someone tells you, all right, go ahead. And you're like, well, no, that's not the way. So anywho, so with the book, I just basically followed my guideline, and I wrote a chapter on, and I'm not going to like go into the details, because Russ has asked me not to do that yet, but we're just talking about the process of writing the book. But I can't talk about the chapters. There's a chapter on Phaladrias and Chlorosoma, so the Barron's racers, and then Chlorosoma viridissimus, which is another one that we keep that's actually a little bit spicy. Musaranas are in there. Tricolor hognose snakes and xenodon are in there. Obviously, false water cobras are in there. The genus Lyophis, formerly Lyophis, now Erythrolampris, are in there. And then I was like, well, people don't even know what the hell a xenodontine is. So I decided in the 11th hour, we're just going to write a chapter that's all like snake taxonomy and go over all the tribes, and then do zoogeography and natural history, but then write it in a fun way where people aren't bored to death. So that whole process was the most cathartic thing I've done writing in my life. Like, I promise you, as long as I live, I will be writing books, because this was therapy to me. I got to nerd out, geek out, swim in that stew I keep talking about.
Yes.
So I write the book. And then I'm like, I made a Facebook post. I have my like false water cobra coming down, and I'm like, look, guys, the book's done. And Julander and Nick Mutton, who wrote the Complete Carpet Python, they both like private messaged me and were like, did you get the pictures yet? And I was like, no. And then they were like, you're not done yet. And then the next year and a half began of me trying to track down pictures of obscure snakes that live across South America, with people who are taking the pictures that speak Portuguese and Spanish. And guess who's never been to South America? This guy. So I had to go and basically, get over 200 photographs, and I'm a perfectionist, so not just any picture is gonna do. So that process, I was not prepared for that process. That was insanely time consuming. It was really weird. I kept telling Russ, I feel like I'm digital herping. Like, I would go online and then be like, oh my God, there it is. Just like, I'm out in the field. I'm like, oh my God, they got a Erythrolampris miliaris. Like, I remember when there's this one picture, actually it was Hydrodynastes bisinctus, the other water cobra.
Oh yeah.
There's hardly any pictures of it. And I just stumbled on this guy's Flickr page, and I stalked him like I would stalk an animal in the field for like a month and a half. I did everything I could to get in contact with him. And then finally I got in contact with him through a friend through Instagram. And he just sent this really benign, sure, you can use them, and use the pictures, email message to me. And you would have thought that I just found like a new species of snake on top of Mount Everest. I was so freaking excited, and those pictures are in the book, and they literally make the bisinctus section. But what I didn't realize with
Amazing.
writing a book is that it takes a village. Like I had to get all these people to buy into my project. There's no money. And so I'm like, begging and pleading people to use their photographs. And the photographers from South America were just phenomenal. I love them all.
Mm.
They were just as excited that somebody gave a crap about their animals. Like, I think that there's people in Brazil right now that are more excited about this book than the people in America that are excited about this book, because their fauna finally has a voice or a place to, be. So that's been fun. And so then we get it all laid out, and we had to write Russ wanted a forward where you have somebody of like clout write about how good the book is.
Yeah.
And we're throwing names around, and Russ just serendipitously, just nonchalantly goes, well, I think we can get Mark O'Shea to write the forward. And that's like my childhood hero. Like, that's like saying to somebody who's a priest, well, maybe Jesus will write the forward. I was just like, are you kidding me? So he agreed to write it. And then I was like, oh God, like he's writing it. And one of the things about writing in science is our stuff goes through peer review, and it is a bloody process. Like you have to have a thick skin. And thank God I have had 60 peer-reviewed papers, because it took that many for me to go through the process of Mark O'Shea reviewing this book. This book is 1,000 times better than it was when I thought I was done, because O'Shea went through it word by word. Anybody that thinks he's just a TV personality, you are wrong. He is a card-carrying, hardcore herpetologist. That book is so much better because it has his fingerprints all over it. And there were and it was really funny because I didn't want to write a textbook. I didn't want to write what we call a monograph. I wanted it to be a fun book. And I don't think O'Shea knew that at first, because the comments that I was getting were like, this is not proper. This is not proper. What the hell are you doing? Like it escalated quickly, And then I think it was like around page 40, I'm picking up that this is a popular press book. And I was like, yeah, it is. It's not a textbook there. So, anywho, but no. So like the entire process, I've learned a lot. I can flat out tell you, I'm going across the country. I'm starting the Heterodon book this summer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have a camera. I'm taking a lot of pictures. The photographic process of writing a book and getting the photographs, I got a little bit of PTSD from that. Like I got Flickr pops up on my, computer monitor, and a cold chill goes down my spine. So yeah, no. But it won't be as hard, I think, because hognose snakes, like everybody takes a picture of a hognose snake when they find them.
Yeah.
But
true.
I know what I want to do with that book, and it's gonna be a lot of fun. So I am really looking forward to pulling the trigger on that. But I'm getting my ducks in a row, getting organized, and then that will start in May. So
amazing.
I don't know if that answered the question, but
No,
there it
great.
is. But you got to be careful, because with the self-publishing, the problem is, just like with Facebook, anybody can publish a book now. Like, it's a get-rich scheme with Amazon. So I don't mean to sound like gatekeeperish, but I feel like you need to have a certain level of I don't know, expertise. And there's parts of the book that I wrote on the xenodontids where, I'm the first one to admit I didn't go to South America. But I was writing this from the perspective of a keeper. I've kept all the species. I've bred all the species. I've raised all the species. I know the nuances of all the species. And I knew that I had the skill set, to take all that scientific literature and distill it down in a manner where it would be fun to read, because a lot of times it can be somewhat monotonous. So,
yeah, of course.
That's true.
And then the voice of the book, I wrote it the exact way I teach my classes. Like, I kept giving sections of it to my students, and I had them read it, and then I would say, like, what's that how does this read? And they would basically say, it's like you're teaching. Because I want it to be, I don't want it to be just science. Like I found out a bunch of random facts about various species, and I say things like, this is incredibly awesome, which is not really what a lot of people that write these books do. But, you know, I have no problem letting people know that I think this stuff is pretty freaking awesome.
Yeah.
So,
damn, what a colossal effort that must, you know, it's remarkable.
I have to shout out to Russ,
Mhm.
because I would write it and then he would lay it all out and then read it, and then I would read it, and then we would give it to Mark, and somehow he would find 30 typos in 10 pages that Russ and I missed. I don't know how this happened, but you know, and I don't want people to think the book's bad because of that. That's just me being honest. Anytime you write anything, you can misspell. One thing I do a lot is I spell the, and my fingers are going as I'm typing, and I spell it HTE. And then when I'm reading it, my brain just puts the letters right, and I totally miss that it's misspelled, you know. And when you write a book, you read the chapters over and over and over and over and over again. So those you're so fixated on, did I write this genus right, that you completely forget about spelling the.
Right.
So, you know, so that's kind of that process. But we send it off to the printer. We're going to get a couple copies back, according to Russ. We'll go through those, and then we'll ultimately fix whatever we find in the printed form, and then it should be out. I'm almost certain that the book will be out by summer.
Nice.
Awesome. I can't wait for that book.
Yes.
Yeah, it's gonna be great.
I will definitely buy it, and you can tell Bob Ashley, and he'll be like, "Who's Roy?"
I'm not mad at Bob.
No, I know you're not.
It was kind of funny because nothing inspires you. Being a repressed nerd, nothing inspires me more than somebody saying like, "Well, that's not going to work." I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah, totally. I can relate to this. Yeah.
Total tangent. Well, it's not a tangent, but so one of our previous guests, Jordan Russell.
Yes. I love that episode, by the way.
He's a great guy. I love Jordan, and none of this is to mess with him or give him a hard time, but it is to kind of give him a little bit of a hard time. Years ago, before, way before Roy and I started doing this, I had an idea to do a reptile podcast. And I remember reaching out to him, and I was like, man, I'm curious what you think about this. I've been really thinking about doing, I think it might make sense, but I was thinking about making a reptile podcast. And he told me, no, I don't think there's a market for it. I don't think I don't know. I think you'd be hard pressed to really keep it going. And how would it look? And I don't mean to make fun of the guy. I mean, I'm not even sure he remembers the conversation, but I remember being like, maybe he's right. Yeah. And then years later, here we are. That's kind of a funny little aside. But I digress. We are coming right up near 2 hours, and I'm not necessarily trying to close out the convo or anything quite like that. But I would like to. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you more about crayfish.
Okay.
So
Yes.
as long as that's cool. So
and it's fine.
Earlier we were talking about the ways in which herpetoculture kind of can have a lot of infighting, and maybe there can be some disagreements between private keepers and zoological institutions and researchers and conservationists. Does that same kind of split or headbutting exist in the crayfish community as well?
It exists in every
Okay.
organismal biology community.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting about the crayfish community is when I say there's 9, there's 9. Like there are not that many. What's really kind of cool is I'm not saying that like I'm responsible for this, but I put out a lot of grad students out of my crayfish lab, and then I tell all of them like, go get a PhD. So a lot of them are going to get PhDs and aspire to be professors, which then gives people opportunities to study these animals, to build a community. Like that's how this works. But there's definitely camps, and the camps are different. One of the big camps is with crayfish is one of the things that's nuts that people don't realize is there's a lot of undescribed diversity in North America. You do not have to go to Peru or, the Congo to find a new species. In my instance, the closest species I found that was undescribed was 2 hours from my house.
Yeah.
So with the crayfishes, and I know right now after talking with the arthropod realm, there are absolutely undescribed mites walking around in the leaf litter behind my house right now that I step on every time I go outside. So like there's plenty of undescribed diversity. Well, right now, this whole idea of like, what is a species? How do you define a species? There's a handful of ideas as to what you have to do to describe a species. And with crayfishes, since there's all this undescribed diversity, we're still in this really weird place of discovery. It's like extremely old school biology where you go in and you just simply try to figure out what crayfish live in this watershed and do they all have names? And you're doing that in like Tennessee and North Carolina. I'm not going to the rainforests. I'm going to Asheville. So, and there's some people that have a very conservative view of what constitutes a species. There's others that would argue they have a liberal view. There's one group that has a completely dichotomous view. And so you kind of get into your camps. But then what we do is we come together and we present our data in front of each other. And one of the things I love about the crayfish community is that we can absolutely duke it out and then go drink a beer with each other at the end of the day. It is not a hostile world. When I was in grad school to become a professional herpetologist, go get my PhD, I spent 2 years in academic herpetology back in the early 2000s and realized this is not my scene. I am far. I don't have an ego. I don't care if you I don't go look what I did. There was an awful lot of that. That's not as prevalent today as it was back then. And that was one of the things when I went to crayfishes that I was like, okay, these people are kind of like, oh my God, there's a new guy. Come on in. We need more people. It was a very different world. What's really interesting though, is people absolutely keep crayfishes the way we keep herps. And I am quite literally in the seat of the biologists that are looking at crayfishes being held in human care. And I'm having a complete and total aneurysm. Yeah. And I do feel hypocritical because I'm like, you can't do that. You can't keep that thing in a tank. And then I go home to 80 snakes in my basement.
Fascinating.
It's but the difference is there's crayfish that are parthenogenic. And so you take one crayfish and you get tired of it and you throw it in the pond out back. And by the end of the summer, it's 1,200 crayfish. And then you have a flood and they escape into the watershed. And now it's 50,000 crayfish. And I literally just described what's happened on Madagascar. Madagascar has a genus of crayfish called Astacoides. They're only found there. They're Madagascar endemics, just like lemurs. This thing called a marmot was released there, and now it's taken over. And it's quite literally causing things to go extinct. So it's a little bit different scenario, but at the same time, it is kind of interesting where I end up. So yeah, but I absolutely love the crayfish. And the other thing about crayfish is it was a very easy segue for me because if you think about a crawdad, it's about the same size as a salamander or a frog. So a lot of the methods I learned being a field biologist, studying animals that live in aquatic ecosystems, I could apply that to the crayfish. It was a one-to-one, transition. Wow. And then I looked at this field and nobody was doing natural history science with crayfish. And it was like a wide open field, and it's been a ton of fun. So
wow.
Yeah,
amazing.
I totally get it. I mean, they're fascinating. Those of us who love critters, just it's a critter.
Totally
when I was a kid, I
the burrowing
I spent a lot of time in the creek catching them.
Yeah, the burrowers here on the southeast Mid-Atlantic United States, they're totally linked up with herps. There's the crawfish frog, Massasauga rattlesnake, Kirtland snake. So I can totally take my two favorite groups of organisms and study them at the same time. So that's pretty freaking phenomenal. One of the best days of my life is I went up the road to a state park in Pennsylvania because they asked me to come and look at this burrowing crayfish colony, because the burrowing crayfish colony was what was enabling Massasauga rattlesnakes to live there. And I got my life for a Massasauga rattlesnake adjacent to my favorite species, the burrowing crayfish's burrow. And like, that was almost too much for my brain to handle. It was just like, this is Zen. Like, this is perfection right here. I got a pit viper and a crawdad. It doesn't get any better than this. So
that is awesome. Yeah, I can feel the stoke.
Yeah.
By proxy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Super stoked.
Amazing.
So there you go.
Well, gentlemen, I'm actually starting to feel a little gross. I'm really, I apologize. I'm not, I've started out this conversation with a lot of energy, and this cold is really starting to catch up with me. My fiance and her sister have been sick for 4 days, and I'm really worried that I'm going to hit the worst of it. But if it's okay with you guys, I'd like to maybe get to the maybe a couple of closer questions if that's okay.
That's totally fine.
But with all of that said, I also just want to reiterate that I would really love it if you'd be willing to come on it more than once.
Oh, I will come to your show anytime you want me to come on, man.
Oh, amazing. Okay,
awesome.
Cool. Because I know that you, as along with many of our other guests who have spawned these really wonderful, thought-provoking conversations. I feel like half the time we don't even get to like the real meat. Sometimes we don't even really get to some of the stuff that we thought we would talk about, you know? Totally. So I know that we'll probably have many more interesting conversations to come.
Sure.
Great. Amazing. So I guess with that in mind, Roy, maybe is there one or two questions that you want to throw out before we hit the last one, or what are you thinking there, sir?
I kind of think we should just go with the last one, because I had a few others here that I kind of feel like we kind of touched on, you know, it was, and yeah. If Zach's willing to come back and join us again, I think that moving towards closing makes sense. At that mark, and if your energy's flagging.
Okay, cool. Sorry, and apologies to anyone listening.
It's all good, man.
You know, it's
I get it.
It's it feels like we've been dealing with a lot of colds here in Colorado. Like, you know, I had RSV in October that just jacked me up, and then my fiance's been
oh my god.
Yeah, dude, it's been real bad. But
I don't think quarantine was very helpful for all of our immune systems.
No, it wasn't.
Not for mine.
Years of isolation. No.
No.
Okay, so with that in mind, the question, Zach, is why herpetoculture? And you know, of course, take that in any way that you wish, and feel free to elaborate on it as much as you'd like. And certainly no need to make it too short or anything like that.
Sure.
But why do we do this? Why do you do it? Why do we do it? Why do we do it societally? What's the value? What do you make of this weird discipline that we all seem to derive into?
So I obviously, as I said, have listened to every episode of your podcast. So I knew this question was coming, and I've thought about this a while. Yeah. And to be totally fair to myself, I want to answer this from two different perspectives.
Yeah.
So perspective one is just why herpetoculture, societally, why do we need it? You know, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I would argue that herpetoculture is an outlet for a lot of people who are trying to engage nature, but at the same time want an intimate relationship with it where it's in their home. So it's this kind of weird, crazy amalgamation, and I've used that word a lot, but it's the word that keeps popping up, of loving nature and wanting to be out there, but then us quirky, weird, nerdy reptile folks just happen to like animals that can live in a 6-foot box. And so you can bring that little piece of nature into your, your home, and then it's part of your home. And then it is in theory part of you. So it leads to this kind of connection that we're all kind of striving for. And we may not even know that we're striving for it. So that's like kind of a societal thing. But for me, I need what herpetoculture is to me is now it is a part, it's a part of me, but I mean, it's part of my life force. Like I wake up in the morning and I look outside and I see that the sun's up and I identify the birds that are calling and I think about my wife and my family. What are we doing today? And then I think about the barometric pressure outside. And then what influence is that having on my animals? What do I need to do with my like, it's just this kind of ever-present force. And that's why I said it's a discipline to me, because it's literally something that I am striving to do to the best of my ability. I'm striving not to get trenched down in dogma. I'm striving to question everything all the time and at the same time be okay with what I'm doing. And that's just so much more than a hobby, because it's literally me. So when I say what is herpetoculture, it is part of me. That's my answer at a personal level. Like, I don't think I got away from herpetoculture there for about a decade and a half. I don't think I'm getting away from it until I die. Like, I don't see, I'm not just going to have a corn snake in a 20-gallon lawn. That's what I had for like 10 years.
Yeah.
The corn snakes that I pulled out of brumation are going into a 4x2x2 with a naturalistic background and, all this stuff. So I don't know if that answered it, but it's absolutely the best way that I can address that question, because that's what I think it is.
I think that answered it quite precisely. I mean, it's incredible to me that we've asked this of everyone, and we continue to get new responses to the question. I mean, I feel like I've had some really funny like sort of fantasies about when we are like a couple hundred shows deep, putting out like a small booklet or something that just has a couple hundred, maybe the book titled Why Herpetoculture, and it's just page after page after page after page of answers, maybe condensed, and then with who said it, because I feel like that'd just be so interesting. Or some kind of, I feel like that could end up being like an interesting coffee table book for herpetoculturists, something cool that we might be able to do in the future or offer to people. Or maybe it'll be something we offer as a gift, or something we can, or something people can get at one of our Herpeton.
There you go.
Yes, here we go.
We make them, so I feel like there's something in that. But I think you gave that's a great answer, and it's one that resonates with me. I mean, I really feel like the calling herpetoculture a discipline just touched my soul because it's just, I couldn't agree more with you about that. I've never been satisfied by the term hobby, even though I understand why people use it and all of that. So I appreciate your answer. It's a good one. Thank you for that.
Like, there are people that do it as a hobby, and then there are people that do it as a discipline.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
But I think that if you're at the level, I mean, you have a shop, Phil.
I do.
You have a literal building full of Uromastics. That is not a hobby.
It's not a hobby. It's not a hobby. It's
some would say it's a problem.
Yes.
There was very little difference between me and a person with a problem. Yes.
There you go.
It's just a small step in one direction or the other, let me tell you.
But of the problems that people could have, a warehouse full of obscure North African, Middle Eastern lizards, I mean, come on.
It's a good problem.
It's a good problem. It's a good problem. Let me tell you, those bastards. Oh my God. It's like the very beginning of breeding season over here. And man, I like the fact that I can this has been tripping me out for a while now, but the fact that I can hear from across the shop when I've put a pair of Uromastics together and I can hear when they're mating, and I'm like, I need to go note this. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's like, it's a totally different noise than when the female's flipped over and the male's spinning on her. It's a totally different noise when one's chasing the other, but it's not a fun one. It's like they're mad at each other. It's a totally different sound, and I feel like such a creep. It's such a it's such a silly thing. Oh God. But anyway,
Yeah.
anyway.
Little things we pick up along the way.
Oh God, I know, it's so silly. It's what a silly, completely unapplicable pattern recognition niche. It's only applicable in my weird warehouse full of heroes, you know. Anyway, Zach, thank you again so much. Where can people pay attention? Where can people find you on the interwebs and
Sure.
pay attention to what you're doing, and where can they find your book?
So you can find me on Instagram, Dr. Crawdad there. And on Facebook, I'm just Zach Loughman. Feel free to message me at any point in time. I'd be remiss if I didn't plug the podcast. So I do a podcast with Matt Most, Colubrid and Colubroid Radio with the NPR network. We can be friends. So there you go.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We are friends.
Sure.
Yes, it's an amicable relationship.
Absolutely.
So that's where you can find me. And then I always, any outlet I'm at, if you are entertaining the idea of doing this academically, I'm certain there's got to be somebody else where you can do herpetoculture and get a master's degree, but I am the only person I know of that openly advertises it. So, you know, the degree is online. It's the Zoo Science Master's degree in biology at West Liberty University, and I'm the chair of that department. So I'm the guy who literally is on the decision-making committee. Just because you reach out doesn't mean you're going to be accepted to grad school, but at the same time, you know, if you're interested in that, give me a holler. I got some solid students coming in the fall that we're going to do some pretty badass stuff. And that's super, super exciting to me. So that is that. And then as far as the book, just get on like my page. I guarantee you when the book comes out and is available, it'll be blasted all over the internet. And you can get it then. So, because I don't know exactly how we're going about that process yet. I mean, I have ideas, but so.
Right.
Yeah. But I also just want to take this time real quick, because I know you're like reaching delirium with the virus.
No. Take your time.
But like, I really love what you two are doing. This is a part of herpetoculture that herpetoculture desperately needed. I love the fact that you have these fun, quirky, nerdy, but at the same time, meaningful, cerebral conversations. Just keep doing what you're doing. So that's all I have to say. I had to say that before I got off here.
Well, I gotta pitch it back, because you do a lot for herpetoculture, and I know that it's witnessed by many and appreciated by many, but like from me to you, like, just thanks for what you're doing. It's really an inspiration.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Right back at you, man. Seriously, I second everything Roy just said, and it's extremely gratifying to hear that kind of praise from you, because we really appreciate everything you're doing as well. So thank you so much for that. And really looking forward to the next time. Really.
I am as well.
Roy, you want to hit that?
All right, everybody. 3, 2, 1. That's it.